The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organization.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
So we have time for a discussion now. And I've already received quite a number of questions, which I will proceed to direct to the speakers. Let me perhaps start with a question for Dr. Satterthwaite. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that there's probably a continuum between the literal and the non-literal reading of scripture. I guess some of the questions from the participants dwell on this point about how maybe those who are against Christian Zionism are too free with a more spiritual type of interpretation, and whether that desire to read the Bible in a more literal way is actually more honoring to the Bible as God's word, in terms of taking it seriously. I guess there's the larger issue of what does it mean for the Bible to be God's word? How do we interpret it? What are the issues of hermeneutics? Would you care to comment a bit more on this issue of a literal fulfillment?
Right. Well, first of all, there's no text in the Bible that tells us that all of it must be read literally. I would say that's often quite a sensible working rule for large parts of the Bible, but you've got to make the decision whether to read literally or in some non-literal way based on the kind of text it is. For example, Revelation, I would say, on the whole, your default rule should be it's to be interpreted symbolically. The literal reading should not be your first recourse. I would say that we need to read the Bible as it's been put literarily, that's to say, in accordance with the author's intentions, as far as we can work them out, rather than literally. One reason, let me just say this and then stop. One thing that causes me to be inclined non-literal understanding of the fulfillment of many of the promises to Israel is because that's what the New Testament seems to engage in. It seems to offer quite extensively, as I've said, all sorts of images, languages, themes, which in the Old Testament refer to Israel's restoration, are taken by the New Testament writers and applied to Jesus or to the Church of Jesus Christ. Let that suffice for an answer. I mean, there's a lot more that could be said, but.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Satterthwaite. I guess this is really a big issue, and I guess really your point about how we cannot be literal all the time, that's probably quite helpful as well. There are some points where we have to let go of that.
Yeah.
Maybe a second question for you, Dr. Winkler. I guess there's this question about how do the Christian Zionists see the conversion, how important do they see the conversion of the Jews to believe in Jesus? Am I to say that there's probably a difference between the older Christian Zionism that would see such conversion as integral to the restoration, and maybe the more dispensational view that would see that there's a separate way for them to salvation? I mean, how would they see this issue?
Yeah, it depends on who you're speaking of. There's again, because Christian Zionism's been around for a while, it's kind of mutated and evolved into various branches and strands, which inevitably when a movement has been around for a while. But if you want to give it two major strands in terms of that dialogue question, one is kind of the John Hagee strand, which would say no proselytizing of the Jews. He was criticized for this when he came out with a statement in 2007 that suggested that the Jews had a parallel covenant with God, that it was their covenant with God was different than the Christian covenant through Jesus. And I'm glad that he got jumped on for that, because that's completely inappropriate for a number of reasons. But it has granted him unprecedented access. And this is part of my critique with respect to the tendency to, if you have a political alliance or you are given or granted access, power, etc., it's very easy to overlook or to even make some really bad decisions with respect to your theological and political, for that matter, too. But in this case, it's a really bad theological decision. The second one, the second kind of strain is the idea that at some point, and Dr. Satterthwaite mentioned this from Romans 11, that all Israel will be saved is interpreted to mean that at some point, and we're not sure how. This is the question that many Christian Zionists are unclear about and aren't going to demand an answer to, but at some point, there will be a definitive turning of the Jewish people to Christ. And that how that happens and when is a matter of debate and speculation.
Thank you very much for the clear explanation. Dr. Satterthwaite, one of the participants was asking, at the start of your presentation, you raised up the issue that there was a 2,500-year gap for the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy, as claimed by Hal Lindsey. This participant was saying, is a long duration necessarily a problem for prophecy? For example, he or she was pointing out that we are still waiting for the return of Christ, since the New Testament was written. How would you respond to that?
Not necessarily a problem, but if you read Ezekiel, Jeremiah, some parts of Isaiah 40 to 66, you don't get any sense that these are things that are going to take place a long, long way in the future. Ezekiel in particular, he seems to speak as though the rise of Babylon and its conquest of sort of Israel and going down into Egypt marks a turning point, which will then lead to the return of Israel to the land, and God's purposes will have moved on a significant stage. No suggestion that this is going to be drawn out over 2.5 millennia. Yes, it's true, we still wait for the return of Christ, but no, there's nothing, I would say, so clear in the New Testament that says this is going to happen soon. And I was particularly concerned by this idea of the clocks. Well, I mean, maybe it was an unfortunate image that Lindsay used, and we shouldn't dwell too much on it, but how can prophecies be put on hold for so long? It's been seriously asked. If the fulfillment's delayed that long, is it really a fulfillment anymore? So I think I'd probably, it's when you look at the text of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, you don't get the sense that they're speaking of things that are going to happen long, long into the future. Not when they speak of Israel's return and describe it in such glowing terms.
So it's the different natures of the prophecies in question here.
So say that again.
It's the different natures of the prophecies that are in question here.
Yes.
Different way they are put here.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Dr. Winkler, one of the participants is curious to know how do the contemporary Jews today view the movement of Christian Zionism? Is it something that they welcome, or is it something that they view with suspicion as well?
Again, it depends on who you ask. Like, for example, when I was having conversations with some Jews in the Holy Land in 2017, and it was with respect to Trump's kind of discussing about bringing the embassy to Jerusalem. And a lot of them were like, we don't want it. We don't want to stir the pot. there's enough trouble in this place. We don't need extra trouble by playing these kinds of political games of, well, it has to be in Jerusalem because that has to be the center of the Jewish, the heart of the Jewish nation. So in that respect, on the ground, you're not going to get a lot of support for some of the Christian Zionist zeal. However, they love the money. I hate to say that, but they sure love the money coming in because it is a big cash cow for Israel. And it has raised millions and millions of dollars for the benefit of the Israeli state, especially the political benefit, not necessarily the people, but certain political factions and connected individuals. So again, it depends on who you're talking to and what, with respect to what is their benefit.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Seems like there's a very wide diversity even in the movement on many issues. There's this particular question from one of the participants who just posed the question of whether are we promoting a kind of a replacement theology here in this seminar? Okay, I'm not very sure how do you define this term replacement theology, but maybe Dr. Satterthwaite, would you like to try to give your perspective on this question? Would you say you're promoting replacement theology?
It could be put that way. I think the way I want to put it is to say it's fulfillment theology. God has been faithful to his promises in the Old Testament in sending Jesus. And it's now Jesus and the Church of Jesus Christ, which is the agent of God's purposes. The church, which of course is made up ideally of both Jews and Gentiles. Latterly, for many centuries, the Jews have been a tiny minority in the church, but that's not the picture in Acts to start with. Now, if you say that God was using Israel in the Old Testament and God now uses the church in the New Testament, it's hard. I mean, in a way, it's hard to avoid the term replacement theology. But that sounds as though the Jews have been set on one side. You know, God's finished with them. He's now found the church a more satisfactory instrument of his purposes, which I think it's untrue to the New Testament. That's not what the New Testament says. It's important to say that if you say that the church is the instrument of God's purposes, that's not to deny that individual nations cannot have a part in those purposes as well. And that's why I'm open to the possibility of the nation Israel returning to Christ and kind of being part of the church, but a significant nation by itself. The church does not destroy nationhood. We retain our nationalities when we become Christians. That's going to be part of the diversity of the church. It is now and in the world to come. So yeah, it would be hard for me to say I'm not a sort of replacement theology person, but it's not my preferred term, put it that way, because it seems demeaning then to Jews, and I wouldn't want that to come across at all.
So you would suggest maybe fulfillment theology, yes, would be a better term.
Yeah. That's my preferred term, yes.
Dr. Winkler, do you have a view on that question on replacement theology?
Well, yeah, I would agree that, I mean, I guess you could say inevitably some things are replaced, if you want to use that term, with respect to, part of Hebrews' purpose in the New Testament is to explain some of that aspect. But I agree with Dr. Satterthwaite that it's a loaded term. And so it may not be the most helpful term, even though, because it tends to be given perhaps pejoratively. I don't know, not necessarily, but I think that it's better to speak in terms of, and I agree with the way he described it in terms of a fulfillment, because there is the possibility of ongoing fulfillments. And I would assume that's the case, that God is still working and fulfilling his purposes and plans in our time, obviously. And we don't know exactly how and when all of these things will come to their culmination. But yes, Christ is certainly a major aspect of fulfillment. And so we don't talk about a new covenant versus an old covenant without recognizing that some things truly were new, and some things truly have become superseded, if you would. So I think it's fair to talk about it that way, but at the same time to recognize the continuities and the aspects of continued fulfillment.
Right. So not to be trapped maybe in the negative connotation of that term, you know, but maybe to use terms that are more that we prefer. Yeah. There's this interesting question set in the Singapore context regarding the freedom that we have to embrace maybe versions of Christian Zionism here in Singapore. I guess the two of you have been in Singapore for quite some time. Okay, given our unique multi-religious and multi-racial context, together with the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, you know, would you say that there are some versions of Christian Zionism that would maybe not be helpful in the Singapore context in terms of maintaining religious harmony? Would it maybe contravene possibly some of the regulations that we have here? Dr. Winkler, do you have any examples of maybe very extreme versions of the movement that might not be helpful for us here in Singapore?
Gosh, that's a tough question. I mean, I think the central, again, I'm not gonna venture to say or identify a specific group that is perhaps putting the Religious Harmony Act in danger in Singapore. I'm not aware of that, so I don't think it's a problem here. And honestly, thank God for that, because there are places where that's a problem. And so with respect to that, I think most Christians, even Christian Zionists, understand the importance of respect and the recognition that we live with other religions, and we do not demand some sort of conversionist position for others. We offer the gospel as an opportunity and as a chance for people to embrace the Messiah, for example, as Jesus. But it is incumbent upon us to do that with gentleness and respect, as First Peter calls us to do. And I think that with regard to Singapore, Christians do a pretty good job of maintaining that level of respect and recognition for the integrity of other religions here.
Yeah, Dr. Satterthwaite, you have some comments on that?
Nothing to add, really. I'm not aware of any such of it being a big issue in Singapore, except in the churches where it's debated. I first, in the circles I lived in Britain, Christian circles I moved in Britain, Christian Zionism as a whole was not a big issue. It was only when I came to Singapore that I found I had to formulate a position and actually think it through for the first time. But that's solely in dialogue with other Christians. I'm not aware, for example, that it's a source of tension, say, between Christians and Muslims in Singapore. I may be wrong about that, but I don't think it is. So I don't see that it's a big issue as regards the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. Yeah.
Right, thank you. I guess on a similar issue, I guess one of the participants just curious to find out whether is the attitude to support Israel on the part of Christian Zionism, is it also maybe encouraged by some sort of Islamophobia on the part of this group as well, like kind of anti-Islam movement that maybe motivates them? Would you say that's a factor, Dr. Winkler?
It could be. I mean, I hate to say that because, again, I want to be careful not to kind of put people into a box. And I think sometimes it's ascribed to people from the outside. That is to say, if you're pro-Israel, then other people will sometimes say you cannot be pro-Muslim. And that I don't think is fair either. Although Christian Zionists have sometimes deserved that label because of their tendency to be unconditional in their support of Israel and their tendency, therefore, to ignore the plight of Palestinian Arabs as well as Palestinian Christians. So in that regard, yes, it's a danger to Christian Zionism to fall into this trap of you become wholly supportive of one and vilify the other. And the same danger has happened on the other side. And that's a tragedy as well, to somehow suggest that if you are pro-Arab, you must be wholly anti-Israel. And so I want to kind of turn that around to make sure that we're not unfair in either side of the equation.
Thank you very much. I guess this is maybe more of a question that comes from me for Dr. Satterthwaite. I've always been fascinated and puzzled and also troubled by the difficult passage that you mentioned, Romans 9 to 11, in the letter of Paul. I'm just wondering whether, could you just share with us your quick thoughts on this passage, and maybe how does it relate to the modern nation of Israel that we see today? Would you be able to share some of your perspectives on this very difficult passage for us?
I think the probable answer to that is no. I'm not a New Testament scholar. All I would say it is a much disputed text, and it's a text in which Paul, the term Israel requires a certain fluidity. At times he says that not all who are how does he put it? Not all who are Israel belong to Israel. Or is it the other way around? That's I mean, the term itself is undergoing examination from a number of points of view. So when at the end Paul says, and that is how all Israel will be saved. Well, the question is, how is he using that term, all Israel? And there have been various suggestions there. Does it mean all Jews living at the time? A significant number, proportion of Jews living at the time? All Jews who've ever lived? Does it mean alternatively, possibly, has the term been redefined? So it means now the entire family of Abraham, Jew and Gentile. My goodness, Tom Wright in his book on Paul and the faithfulness of God has 100 pages on this, and they're dense pages. And I'm not a New Testament scholar. All I would say is that it's, I find it's a text on which I have yet to make up my mind, and I think that probably came across in my presentation. That's as much as I'll say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And if I could just add just a comment. I think Paul in 9 through 11 is dealing with the exact question that we're dealing with. And that is, given the fact that the Jews seem to have rejected Jesus the Messiah, what does God have to do now with the Jews? That's essentially what I believe Paul is wrestling with in Romans 9 through 11. And it's an incredibly difficult passage to and that's why Paul at the end says, basically he reaches the end of himself. And what does he say? Oh, the depth and the wisdom of the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, unfathomable his ways. Paul kind of throws his arms up and says, wow, I don't know, in a sense. And I think there's a certain humility in that, even within Paul, to recognize, I think Paul is saying, God's still going to deal with Israel somehow. But exactly how? That's a good question. It's a difficult question. And so I think if Paul has certain reticence to appeal to the mystery of God, I think we are well to do so as well. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. A very succinct approach to a very difficult question. My apologies for that. That came from me. Incidentally, I did a paper on Romans 9 to 11 in one of my undergraduate assignments. It almost killed me, basically. Yeah. There's also a question maybe from a more pastoral angle. Okay, this participant is wondering, I guess he has church members and cell group members who are really heavily influenced by conservative American Christian media, that those are the terms he used, consume copious amounts of such media, and therefore has imbibed maybe some of these ideals and values, including Christian Zionism. How would you respond lovingly and maybe help such a member? Dr. Winkler, would you have any pastoral advice in such situations?
Well, again, I mean, we have to keep coming back to the question of, first of all, what do the scriptures really say? That's our first question, because we have to be responsible exegetes, and we have to be careful about tying a lot of contemporary events into ancient biblical prophecies with dogmatism and with bold confidence. At the same time, I would say, how to put this nicely? I would not put a lot of trust or confidence in social media constructs and a lot of the kind of pop culture theology that especially comes out of the United States right now. It's just, a lot of it's just irresponsible, and it's sensational, and it's provocative, and it's thoughtless. So I would be very, very careful. And I would encourage, if somebody's really adamant or passionate, I would encourage reading a book like Dr. McDermott's New Christian Zionism. If they're insistent they really want to be a Christian Zionist, that's okay. But to take a nuanced and balanced approach, and if they're serious about this, then they should take the time. That's what would be my encouragement, is to look at a good resource. Dr. Pawson, and his book is also another good resource. He published in 2008, I believe. And that, again, is balanced. It's careful. So I would direct them, I would redirect their passions to the kinds of resources that will actually be constructive.
Thank you, Dr. Winkler. Yes.
If I may add, redirect them back to Jesus, who is, after all, the center of the New Testament. Ask them, well, is your passion for what people are saying, for talk about the Middle East, is that displacing your devotion to Jesus? Well, is Jesus still important to you? And if that would be, I think, a constructive approach, to say, well, there are other, the Bible, the New Testament is interested in other things as well, which you ought to be interested in.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satterthwaite and Dr. Winkler. I think that's all the time we have this evening for our questions. Thank you very much again for giving very fascinating and excellent presentations to us on your various topics, and for addressing our queries so competently and in such a pastoral manner. Thank you very much for blessing us this evening.